Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with David Cleevely, who is, he's a lot of different things. Scientist, founder, investor, entrepreneur, policy advisor, and now book author. I guess we'll start with the book. It's called Serendipity. It doesn't happen by accident. And, this is a book which is in part a description of a phenomenon, but it's also very autobiographical because you're talking about Cambridge. Cambridge is like a character, and you have spent most of your life in Cambridge as the founder of the Cambridge Science Center, Cambridge Angels, Cambridge Wireless, Cambridge Network, the Center for Science and Policy at University of Cambridge. It makes me want to move to Cambridge. It's a pretty cool place.
It's a great place, Greg. I strongly advocate it. You come at least visit.
Yeah, it's got a lot of the same characteristics of Silicon Valley, except in a much smaller footprint. It's almost impossible to ride your bicycle around Silicon Valley. So I think the book is about engineered serendipity. Meaning that serendipity to many people seems like something which is equivalent to randomness, right? And if it were equivalent to randomness, then you wouldn't really be able to do anything except cross your fingers and hope it happens to you. But you seem to make the case for structured or intentional serendipity, designing environments and maybe even designing a life trajectory, which is optimized. Am I allowed to use that word, right? Or is that contradictory? Optimized for maximal serendipity and basically advocating for a serendipity science. And we, of course, have a science of complexity, which features in there. But I love this idea. I want to start a department of serendipity studies. Maybe that'll be your next thing. If you want to make
me a visitor professor for that, I'm absolutely with you, Greg. This is one of the points about doing this book was to inspire a comment like that. I think we need to do some research, and it's properly cross-disciplinary because it involves network science, it involves behavioral psychology stuff, all of these things that we need to understand how this stuff actually works. We've been taking this stuff for granted. And actually, we need to not just go, oh, that's interesting, and then move on. No, actually, we need to investigate this stuff and think, how can we actually create environments in which good things are more likely to happen?
Well, the environments that you describe, whether it's Silicon Valley or Cambridge or Birmingham back in the 18th century, it seems like those environments evolved somewhat spontaneously, though. Although obviously, you played a big role in making a lot of these things happen at Cambridge. It does seem like their origins are somewhat accidental and were never planned from the get-go.
Yeah, that doesn't mean to say that you can't plan things. So we can look at examples like the Lunar Society, which was formed in 1765, and in a formal naming sense, about a group of people who knew each other and decided that they would get together every month on the full moon when they could travel at night, and would then discuss various interesting ideas in science and art and a whole series of different disciplines. And it was that network of people that made a very significant contribution to the Industrial Revolution in the United Kingdom and led eventually, not just to Watt's steam engine, but then actually putting that steam engine onto rails and actually forming the first steam locomotives. That kind of, and by the way, you can thank whenever you're drinking a soda, the fizziness in that drink is due to Priestley, who was part of the Lunar Society. So there's a whole series of things that came out of this, not just bubbles. And the thing that we need to do is look at how did those things actually happen? Why did that happen? Why did they happen? And is it possible to get some general principles out of this, some insights, so that instead of just relying on chance to do it for us, we can change the odds? And really, serendipity doesn't happen by accident. It's about changing the odds.
Yeah. Well, some of the examples you use, like Darwin's entangled bank, I mean, there we don't have any kind of central planner, right? And of course, Hayek and others talk about spontaneous order where there is no central planner. But I mean, to some degree, there are folks who are playing important roles, making decisions which enable these environments to emerge, right?
Yes, you used the word optimized earlier, which you hesitated about. And you're quite right to hesitate about optimized because it tends to mean that somehow I've defined every single condition and then I have worked out exactly what I'm going to do. But optimization, for example, if you're a species in the entangled bank, is not actually I am precise and perfectly defined. Actually, there's a whole load of variation going on there, and I would engage in a lot of different strategies for reproduction and for eating and so on, and dealing with my competitors, which are probabilistic in nature. They're not rigorously deterministic. And that's what I was trying to get over in that first chapter, that entangled bank is a complex system. And the other point you make about Hayek and about rules and spontaneous order, I mean, obviously there are ways in which spontaneous order arises and so on. But if you think again about that entangled bank and think about that animal or creature or whatever it is that's one of those species, it exists because it is adapted to that environment, and the order is provided by the environment. So we don't escape from having to have some structure in order to have the kind of developments or incentives or take the parallel with economic growth. You cannot have those things without having some kind of structure. Now, where that structure came from is a different matter, but we have to have some kind of structure. And that's what I'm trying to get to with this book. Let's think about the structures that we can put in place so that we can allow those random things to happen and to happen more frequently in a beneficial way.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about these environments as being at the edge of chaos, right? So presumably at one extreme, you have a very rigidly planned environment, and another one you have sort of anything goes, and this is somewhere sort of in the middle. I would like us maybe to elaborate on what those specific characteristics of this environment are, and then maybe think about the extent to which these things are equilibria, because it does seem like these environments are somewhat fragile, and they do tend to tip either in one direction towards too much order or in the other direction towards too much chaos.
Well, this has got the status of a hypothesis. I mean, it was put forward by Stu Kaufman. I mean, it's no coincidence in the book I refer to a lot of people associated with the Santa Fe Institute, because I think there's a lot to think about there. But the idea being that if you are very ordered, you might be efficient at what you do, but you are not going to be robust to how the environment might change in the future. If you are too chaotic, you might get some short-term advantage, but as you say, things might fall apart. The other word you used there was equilibrium. And equilibrium is a funny thing, really. I mean, in economics, it means one thing, which I don't really like to use at all. But an equilibrium in a system is that over time, when you observe that system, it's behaving in a self-similar way, right? If I look at the system behaving over a week, and then I look at the next week, the system is behaving the same way. It is in a kind of equilibrium. But it's never in an equilibrium when you look at it instantaneously, because it's changing all the time. So we need to think, and I think this is. I mean, for me, this is really important. This is about resilience in systems, about how economic systems actually work, as well as, social systems and the other things that we deal with. I'm struggling in the book. I'm beginning to get there a little bit into how to get the vocabulary and the entities in the book that start to describe how can we tackle this level of complexity, because it is truly complex.
Yeah. Well, if you look at Birmingham, for instance, I mean, this seemed to be, um, it seemed to lack resilience, right? So there was this wonderful moment where these folks would get together and all this amazing stuff happened for all the various reasons that you described, but it didn't seem to have the capacity to resist shocks, right? So when those priestly riots happened, the whole thing
Yep.
kind of fell apart. And, we don't talk about Birmingham as the epicenter of, innovation anymore.
Well, you don't talk about it like that anymore, but for the time up until, 1840s, 1850s, even 1860s, Birmingham was a major force in the world economy, and was down to those roots. But you're right to draw attention to the fact that the rules governing the society and the way in which they interacted were not robust. There wasn't a robust governance structure. There wasn't the kind of thing that we would recognize now if you were going to engineer something like that or kind of organization. It was a bunch of people who respected and knew each other, coming from different disciplines, bonded together because they shared these common interests and were very excited about the breakthroughs that were happening in science and art and all sorts of other things. So it was much more, what we might think of as a book club. I mean, those book clubs come and they go. I mean, all of us might have been part of that kind of process. And the priestly riots, of course, you're in very politically turbulent times. We have the Napoleonic Wars coming. There is a backlash against the radical revolution in France. And so the populace turns against these people who are bringing these new and weird ideas they don't understand and, attack a dinner party. And as a result, Priestley has to flee to the United States and, do some good things over there.
Yeah, but you talk about how one of the reasons why they weren't resilient is because they didn't have institutionalized systems, right, for formal meetings, and I guess the concern is when we get these institutions, don't they have a tendency to kind of suppress what led to their creation in the first place? I mean, I'm thinking here at UC Berkeley, where I am, we have the largest number of venture-backed startups of any university in the world, right? And it's this, in part, we have this just crazy chaotic innovation system where there's a graphic of all the different initiatives related to innovation, and the graphics it's like spaghetti. It's just like, mud against the wall. There's all these different organizations and associations. And if you're trying to do a startup here, you spend more time trying to figure out how to navigate this ecosystem initially than you do building your business. And so now there's been all these attempts to try to, create a single portal and, create a committee that's going to oversee all this stuff. And so the concern I have is, well, how do we do that without kind of killing the specialness of this chaos?
Yeah, well, you've got to ask yourself, how do ants exist and build their nests and do such things when they're relatively simple creatures? And the answer is that they've got, a repertoire of 60, 70, 80 rules that they just follow. And the whole thing organizes itself based on those 60 or 70 or 80 rules. There is no, central ant committee directing what all the ants should do in the ant nest. And I think that tells you something about what I meant by governance structure, or rather the rules by which you operate. You may complain that this university system is a bit of a mess, but that's part of its strength. The fact is that you're not going to take anything as being the gospel truth and then go down a single pathway and find that actually you should have turned left instead of going straight ahead or turn right or whatever it is. And that mess is part of, again, why I start the book with the entangled bank, because if you look at ecosystems and how that kind of stuff works in biology, it is a mess. I mean, and biological systems do things that are apparently quite wasteful. Let's take honeybees, for example, right? So honeybee comes back to the hive, does this famous waggle dance figure of 8 with the angles and stuff telling you where it is relationship to the sun and how far it is based on the speed. and the bees then follow the instructions and go off to that source of nectar. But 20% of the bees ignore completely what has just been told them, and they will go off and do random things. Now you think, oh, come on, let's get some committee in the hive to organise this so that they're all efficient. But it's not going to be efficient in the long run, because the source of nectar is going to run out, or something unexpected may happen, and you want resilience. So the bees have evolved in so that they have got what will be an evolutionary stable strategy of 20% going off and ignoring the instructions. Now, you need the same thing in a university. You need people to ignore the instructions, because that's the only way you're going to get to explore the environment and do the different things. And what you describe is very similar to the environment I see here in Cambridge. And they're both very successful.
So, I mean, to what extent is this a matter of, explore versus exploit, the standard framework?
Sorry, say that again. I didn't catch it. To what extent is explore? Oh, to what extent of this is this explore versus exploit? Well, this is the flip that you need to do. There's a recent book called The End of Innovation. I can't remember the name of the author, but actually he talks about this in terms of a broad sweep of history. I'm just getting to the end of the book now, and basically the point is that you have a continual flip between those two things. Now, if you look at the individual incentives for behavior, it is that the people generally in an organization want stability and they want predictability. So there is a tendency to squeeze out all of this innovation madness and random behavior so that you get predictable results. And the worst is when you have your chief financial officer running your organization and completely blind to why the organization existed in the first place. It didn't really exist because somebody did some calculations and worked out an optimal strategy. No, it was created because people had a weird idea, and that idea managed to survive. So we continually have this problem. And there's a chap called Joseph Tainter, who I'm not quite sure whether I mention in the book, but he's one of my kind of go-to authors, although the book he wrote was incredibly boring in the way that it's written. But the basic postulate is that civilizations end. It's the end of he talks about the end of complex societies. And he says they end in two ways. One is that the ratio of useful energy to the cost of getting that energy drops. So, for example, with petroleum, we had about 50 to 1. In other words, we get 50 out for every 1 energy unit we put in. At the moment, we're around about 24 or so, 25, something like that. And that number is steadily dropping, right? So climate change or whatever else it is, petroleum and the way in which we use energy is going to have to change. But the other one he talks about, and is rather interesting, is the way in which bureaucrats tend to take over. And indeed, this book, The End of Innovation, talks about that, particularly in the Chinese context, as to how the overwhelming bureaucracy simply stifled everything all the innovation. So I welcome your spaghetti at the university. I think that's great. I do not welcome the idea of some central committee overseeing it.
Well, maybe we can walk into some of these features. I mean, it seems like these environments that you look to, like Cambridge, like Tel Aviv, like Florence, back in the day, I mean, Silicon Valley, these have certain features that allow knowledge to get transmitted relatively quickly, that allow discovery to happen and so forth. I mean, and there's also a high degree of trust, it seems, within these environments. And so do these all evolve in a kind of complementary fashion? Do they all co-evolve together? Or is there some kind of, sequence that has to take place for these environments to emerge?
Well, there's a certain sequence in there, but I think it's more to do with the iteration that goes on. If I were to, the Lunar Society got snuffed out, but had it not been snuffed out, I think counterfactual is a bit tricky, but if it had it not been snuffed out, I think you could have expanded on what it was doing, provided you thought a bit more about the scaling. And you would have then been able to use that cluster of people to develop the kind of things that you've referred to as either Tel Aviv or Cambridge or other places, or Silicon Valley. I think you do need some individuals who are prepared to stand up and do something. And whether it be with Cambridge Network, which was the original thing that I got involved in, which involved a chap called Herman Hauser, might be familiar to your listeners, and Alec Brers, who was then the Vice Chancellor. We then got a group together who then kind of raised a flag and say, now rally round, we need to do this networking. And that was the beginning of that process. Already, though, people had begun to realize that the kind of competitive stuff of your neighbor down the road wasn't necessarily the best thing to do. So we were already working with fruitful ground. What actually happened in Cambridge, if I can be parochial about this, and it's not that of course I love Cambridge, it's a great place, but it's the example of Cambridge is there because it is a really interesting test case about this. So what happens then is that, I formed a thing called Cambridge 3G, which became Cambridge Wireless, and evolved there a set of governance rules which have made Cambridge Wireless incredibly successful. I then helped with Robert Sanson to do Cambridge Angels and used a lot of the techniques that I'd learned from those other two organizations in how to make the rules for Cambridge Angels. And that kind of thing became self-reinforcing because more and more people were being drawn into these different organizations. And I'm sure if you go back to Silicon Valley and you look at the kind of social anthropology and networking that was going on, you could trace some individuals who were key, and then they formed organizations which then attracted other things. And then gradually you get this iteration, this snowball effect that goes on. What I do in the book is identify that in rather more detail in what happened in Cambridge, but the principles are pretty well the same. You can't, as you gather from the book, I'm a great passionate believer in the personal relationships, and we should get on to some of the mathematics or some of the network theory behind all of this. But those personal relationships and having exemplars who then inspire people to do things that they wouldn't otherwise have thought of doing, turns out, I think, to be a very important ingredient. And if you're going to spark something off in a news centre, you're going to need to have a few individuals who are going to need to be out there leading the charge.
Well, these are like network entrepreneurs, it seems, right? The folks who step up and say, look, I need to bridge these connections. I mean, it seems like there are some people that just seek out these connections. They look for people that are maybe far afield, maybe in a different domain, a different discipline. But then there are others that play the role of almost like matchmakers. I mean, I like to throw a lot of dinner parties, and I like to bring together people who I think are, they don't already know each other, but they have enough in common that they're going to enjoy talking to one another. And it seems like you're somebody who's been doing this your whole life, right? Kind of, putting A and B together and C and D together and waiting for the magic to happen.
Yes, I would say that's true. And, we hold dinner parties and things with exactly the same kind of stuff. If you're going to organise a dinner party, I mean, there's one set of dinner parties that you want where you've got old friends and you all know, but the other ones are exactly as you describe. And to show you how completely obsessive I am about this, when I was involved with the Centre for Science and Policy and organising dinners, and even at the Royal Academy of Engineering, where I've organised dinners I'm obsessed about the seating plan. I'm obsessed about
right.
making sure that that seating plan has enough structure but enough random variety in it so the conversations are going to be interesting.
Yeah. I think there's got to be science to that. But I mean, I was visiting Oxford last year, and I'd never actually spent time in any of these colleges before. It was Oxford, not Cambridge. And at the high table, I mean, it was wild. I'm sitting across from one person who is in, Spanish theater, and another person who is a quantum physicist. And I mean, these are people that in a place like Berkeley, you're never going to meet those people. I mean, if you are doing digital marketing, you're going to spend all your time with people doing digital marketing. And so it seems like there's a trade-off there because, a place like Berkeley can triple the salary of somebody who's at Cambridge or Oxford. And so they're going to pull them away. But there's something that's just so amazing about the interdisciplinarity of a place like, Oxford or Cambridge that is missing in some of these other places.
Yeah. So, Greg, I mean, you're pointing to something which is, one size doesn't fit all. I mean, you can see the advantages, particularly in the United States, about scaling up and the way in which you can focus resources in order to get something moving. And I don't want to underestimate that or downplay it because I think it's incredibly important. On the other hand, just the sheer intellectual excitement of what you've just described, which is, I'm a fellow at Queen's and a fellow at Trinity Hall, two colleges in Cambridge. Some of the conversations are absolutely stunning. And I've even been to Oxford. They've let me in. I had to get a stamp on my passport, but I had a conversation at Balliol a while back where I was discussing zebra reproduction strategies and grazing strategies with somebody across the way. Now, it might have seemed to be completely, irrelevant. Actually, a lot of that then turns up in some way in my book, because, and so I think that's it's really important to have those engines of interdisciplinarity, and you must have those in Silicon Valley. I'm sure those things are going on. It's just that in a smaller city like Cambridge, that is, and Oxford, that's a lot more obvious when you get to a college. Of course, the colleges themselves are only a tiny part of that entire ecosystem, or that entire system that's going on. But they are providing quite a lot of feedstock for both, I say, behavior as well as the insights and cross-disciplinarity. I mean, I started ABCAM with Jonathan Milner, which was sold for $6 billion last year. And that was the result of sitting down at a dinner table and having a conversation.
Well, there's something about the physical environment that is conducive to the development of these relationships and these ideas. And, I used to teach a course on the workplace and met with all these facilities people who are at Silicon Valley. I mean, they give a great deal of thought to this. They want to figure out like who is going to walk past whom, who's sitting next to whom, right? Who's going to be at what meetings. And I think the, work from home movement has kind of disrupted a lot of that because it makes it a little bit more difficult to generate these sort of serendipitous encounters.
Yeah, I think that's a great worry. In fact, I initiated, or with then the chief executive organisation which I helped co-found called Cambridgeshire Head, a report on the new era for the city economy, which was about what the lessons we learned from COVID and how that has changed this working from home and those serendipitous encounters. And it does concern me in particular. Cambridge is the fastest growing city that the UK's ever seen. And its economy has been growing at a rate comparable with Silicon Valley in the 50s and 60s. How do you actually cope with that scale? And of course, as things get larger, the surface area for interactions gets proportionately smaller. And so, I mean, it's like the trade-off between certainty and chaos. I mean, the thing is, how do you get the scale up that you need to compete on the world stage? How do you get that scale up? At the same time, how do you generate those fresh ideas and so on? Now, your description of the university diagram gives some insight into that, because at the beginning you want all that confusion and randomness. But as you scale up and want to, develop things, you actually don't want quite so. You want some of it, and you want to have it perhaps designed into the buildings as you describe, but you've got to get things much more directed at just being efficient as opposed to exploring the environment.
Well, maybe we can talk about specialization, because it seems like, there's an optimal amount of specialization, and it sort of parallels the optimal amount of connectivity that you want to have, right? Do you want to have tightly knit clusters that are loosely connected to other clusters, or do you want to have more of a in terms of network design, when you design a university and you establish departments and journals and so forth, that's basically network building, right?
Yeah. So here's the thing, that you use the word optimization again, and it's
can't help it. I'm an economist.
I used when I was talking about the B's, evolutionary stable strategy. And it might be worth just explaining for listeners exactly what this means. Really, what you have is a repertoire of things that you're going to do. And, you do something 10% of the time and something else 30% of the time and something else 50% of the time and so on. And that repertoire is the mix that actually makes it optimal against the environment that you find yourself in. And we don't actually know what is the optimal mix, because we don't know how the environment's going to behave, and it's rather difficult to calibrate it even now. Even if you knew that was what you wanted to do. So you need an element of randomness in strategy. So you need to have things that are highly focused, and you need some things that are going to be cross-disciplinary and completely wacky. And you'll need different proportions of those. The only way we're going to tell which are the best are by observing in 5, 10, 20, 30 years' time which ones actually paid off. Because I can't tell.
But what are some of the levers that you might have available as the leader of an organization to to sculpt the networks and to modify the connections?
The levers are in part some of your design, the design things you were talking about. You can design physical spaces for to ensure that people bump into each other. There's a very good example of that, which I was involved in the design of, called the Bradfield Centre, which is on the Science Park in Cambridge. And as you walk in to the Bradfield Centre, there's a kind of open space with desks where you register and so on. But very quickly, as you move in, you look towards your left, and there's just areas of just seating with benches and tables and other stuff, and then right over on the left is a cafeteria, and you can see people interacting and bumping into each other. The whole thing was designed with that in mind. And if you go to One Kendall Square, I don't know if you know Ranch Kimball, who was behind all of that. And when I was doing my Centre for Science and Policy, one of the things I went over to Boston to go and have a look at that stuff and look at Harvard and MIT, because people are doing these things and one needs to learn. And, I went round there when this was back in probably 2009, 2010, and it made a deep and lasting impression on me as to how you can design the physical spaces to be able to make that happen. And then there are rules for people's behavior. And I got asked this question by a legal person, a partner in a law firm last Friday, because they're struggling they're saying, well, we're interdisciplinary, if we've got life sciences and we can put you together with people who know about construction and, all these lawyers, and said, well, we're finding it very difficult. And I said, well, look, why don't you take people from life sciences and get them to work for a week or 2 weeks on a construction project, and then get them to work in another place in the organization. And it's not that you're then training that particular person up. What you're doing is you're building a network across the organization so that when somebody mentions something, they go, yes, but I know about that other thing that is going to be able to help us. And in a sense, if you go back to the Lunar Society, that was what was happening. Wedgwood would say, well, yes, but in terms of what I need from a steam engine to help with my factories, this is the requirement. What we say now is being a bit of a customer requirement, but it works internally in all organizations, and you need to put that into place. Because the natural thing is, as we were talking, simply to go into silos.
Right. Yeah. I know in some schools that I've been at, there have been these faculty workshops where faculty were encouraged to attend, even though the fellow faculty member who will be reading their paper, doing research, is completely outside of their domain, right? And so they would use all sorts of inducements like, I don't know, free food, free drinks, right? Free coffee. Sometimes that's all it takes, right, to get these people to do something they wouldn't otherwise do.
Yeah, and I think those are the kinds of things that you need to do. It underlies a lot of the principles that, with my Centre for Science and Policy we've already mentioned, the kind of mixing people. Probably for your listeners, it might be worth just explaining that the Centre for Science and Policy was tackling a significant problem, which is that academics tend to think that policymakers are idiots, and policymakers tend to think that academics are airy-fairy and have no idea about what's happening in the real world, right? Now, of course, both of those statements have elements of truth in them, but the thing is that the standard strategy of the academic to write a 200-page paper and hit a policymaker over the head with it is not actually going to change policy. And so what I did was the policy scheme was for somebody from government to come to Cambridge and meet 30 people. The centre of the modal topic would be what they were interested in, but there'd be a very big random element in all of that, in those 30 people that they met, talked to for an hour. And as one of the very senior members of a major pharmaceutical company said, I'd expected to come along and learn about, the latest developments in biochemistry. And actually, my most important hour that I spent in my entire 30 was with the history of science and policy. And I went back and I completely reframed our R&D strategy. Right? Now, that's just fabulous. And I can't describe that as anything other than serendipity.
Well, it seems like there is also a, personality type or disposition that is complementary to an environment which facilitates serendipity, right? And I guess the question is, do people who have this attribute, right, these people who are curious and who are have the prepared mind, are these the folks that if you put them together, you will get this kind of environment? Or is it more like you create this environment and those are the people that will gravitate to this environment and flourish in this environment?
Well, it's elements of both of those things, isn't it? I mean, you want to set up an environment that will attract the right kind of people who will then reinforce that environment and do those things. But let's also remember that human beings are very plastic in the sense that they will learn pretty quickly. And whilst there's all this debate about, is somebody naturally entrepreneurial? Well, they may be or they may not, but you can probably shift the proportion of people who are willing and able to engage in this kind of networking, again, to change the odds by which things are going to happen. We're not going to get everybody to start to network and start to be sociable. And in any case, that might be rather a daunting and rather odd place to live in as a society. But you could shift some of these behaviours and give people the opportunity to exercise those powers and to learn about how that works. And I think that the that again, in the book, I talk about network structures to try and illustrate that there's some very relatively simple things you can do to make those connections and demonstrate to people that things are useful. And your point about trust, which you made earlier, that point about trust then flows through a network, provided that the number of links between you and the other person, is sufficiently small. And that's another point which once the world becomes a very small world, you have greater trust, you have bigger social capital. You're not going to have bad behavior because actually there are going to be consequences because everybody knows each other. So, there's a lot of stuff that goes on once you start to connect people together and have them so well connected that they're only a couple of hops away from everybody else.
Well, I want to go back to the organizational design issue because, look, designing a milieu, designing a society, designing a community or ecosystem, I mean, that's tough, right? You don't have the kind of control you have if you're running an organization. I mean, Steve Jobs could basically say, I want the bathrooms at the end of the hall and so forth, and I want this kind of org chart. So, if you're trying to build an organization that is capable of adapting to change, why is it so difficult? I mean, what are the pitfalls? Why is there this tendency, and you point to it in the book, for organizations to, even if they start off this way, to ultimately kind of drift away from it, right? Organizations that oftentimes start very innovative, they tend to drift into this bureaucratic rigidity and, they atrophy. I mean, why? It seems like an iron law almost.
Well, it's an iron law which arises for the same reason that you take out insurance, right? There are individual risks that you don't want to run. So I will take out an insurance policy, but in the corporate world, I don't have that insurance policy. If I make a mistake and the fingers are all pointed at me, then I've got a problem, right? So I'm going to avoid making those mistakes. So and you can see that.
But that's got to be due to the performance metrics, right? So as an actor, I'm trying to meet those performance metrics, right?
Yeah. So you can reward that kind of risk taking and celebrate it, and provided it's not reckless, not done for the sake of simply taking risk, but you could reward that, and a company could put into place mechanisms for doing that. I mean, I cite Google's 20%, which they've moved away from, unfortunately. But those kinds of things are mechanisms for rewarding people or giving them the opportunity to come up with fresh ideas and to take risks and to do things. The skunk works idea is exactly that. So there are ways in which companies can design those things into their systems so they don't slip into this risk avoidance. As you say, it's very difficult to change people's behavior, and it requires quite a lot of conscious thought and design. And in many cases, as you mentioned Steve Jobs, visionary leadership to give people this thing the vision that we're actually aiming at.
Well, in my classes, I reference all these examples of companies that failed to adapt, right? Famous stories like Kodak and Blockbuster and so forth. You reference an example I'd never heard of before, which I'm going to use from now on, which had to do with the steam-powered, right, industrial equipment, right?
My favorite, that's from Clayton Christensen.
I don't remember that. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, no, he's in The Innovator's Dilemma. It's my favorite example because it is not a modern technology. This is a, and it's not electronics or software or anything else like that. This is absolutely bog standard. So to describe for your listeners again, a steam shovel was a steam shovel. It was a shovel an excavator powered by steam, and used steel hawsers to be able to move the bucket around. It was a very dangerous thing, because if one of those snapped, it would undoubtedly kill you if it met you on the way, and had huge maintenance and distribution costs. So the whole business model for a steam shovel was that the distributor got 50% of the sale price because it was such a difficult thing to sell, and the maintenance costs were absolutely enormous. And then in 1948 in Birmingham, here we go. Birmingham did do some things after the Lunar Society. In 1948 in Birmingham in the UK, some guys used the hydraulics that we used in aircraft to then construct what we now see everywhere, these diggers, which are all powered by hydraulics. And, when they first came out, they were weak and puny, and they could, but had enormous advantages. They could be clipped to the back of a tractor. And certainly, in after the Second World War in Britain, there was an enormous amount of reconstruction to do and so on. And you need to dig trenches. So these things were ideally suited to nipping into small areas and digging trenches and doing these things. Within 20 years, something like 22 out of the 24 steam shovel companies had gone bust. And the only two that survived were the ones that had set up completely separate entities to exploit this new technology. I think it's a perfect example.
Yeah, I think Steve Blank recently had a post on LinkedIn where he mentioned this town in Indiana that had something like 300 carriage makers. And then when the car was introduced, 299 of them went bankrupt. And the only one that survived was Studebaker, because they moved into autos. And so, I mean, I want to tie this back to serendipity, because, to what extent is the failure of these organizations a failure to have access to information or ideas? Because it seems like, they get exposure, right? I mean, it's there. It's just that organizationally they're unwilling to recognize it, acknowledge it, accept it.
Yeah, Greg, that's a very interesting point. And the question is, human beings, as we know, are not entirely rational. And they get presented with information. It doesn't mean to say that they're going to change their minds or they're going to do something different. If you're in a corporate that has been very successful doing one thing always, unless somebody gives you a very hard kick up the rear end, you're not going to change. And I think that's, and the Clayton Christensen example, and why I went into the margins point, was that at no point for those steam shovel companies did it make any sense to drop, to mess around with their distributor network. At no point did it make any business sense to have something that was cheap and small and was going to require large volume manufacture and all sorts of things. Nothing fitted. So it's, as human beings, we occasionally come across stuff that we're baffled by. And instead of trying to embrace it, we'll just say, well, that doesn't fit. And I think that's what happens with the famous example with Kodak, for example, or with these steam shovels. It just doesn't fit. And if you had enough people in your organization who were exposed to these things, but more importantly, were not part of the main corporate structure, I think that's the clue. 3M did this. I mean, Lockheed, this skunk works. These things need to be separate from the behavioral norms that you see in corporations.
So it's not just exposure to ideas; it's an exposure to norms, to attitudes towards risk, towards. I mean, it's like distributed agency to some degree, right?
Yeah. So again, I didn't cover all of this in the book, but this is a very important point. In the book, I talk about the shape of networks and how you connect things up and so on. And then there's the degree to which Granovetter talks about weak ties and how important they are for enabling things to happen. And we've been talking about innovation and the way of presenting innovation, presenting those kinds of opportunities in that sense that I'm only a couple of steps away from somebody who can tell me about something that's really interesting. But there's another bit, which is Christakis and Fowler's point about the fact that if somebody is less than 3 steps away from me, their happiness influences my happiness. Their political views will influence my political views. Their health,
their obesity influences you, right?
Yeah. So if you think about the networking in that sense, you've actually got to keep, if you're going to get this serendipity to work, you're going to have to create structures which enable those influences to be close to the people that you want to be taking those decisions, and not find yourself, for example, in a classic hierarchy of a corporate where you're 5 levels down. And I give the example of the O-ring in, for the Challenger disaster. 5 steps away, nobody is going to have any influence. It just isn't going to work. And that's again the clue that I was getting to with Christakis and Fowler and the rules of 3. There are ways of thinking about the rules of thumb for constructing these networks in such a way that you will then get the kinds of behaviors that you want. And go back to right at the beginning, you said you wanted to start a research institute to do all this and do some research. Yes, because I think I can see a crack through the door into a wonderland of insight into how organizations operate, how human beings behave, how we could get so much more out of technology and invention and creativity if we thought about how people interact in order to be able to bring that about.
Well, so I think you're also saying then that flatter organizations, right? So most people don't think of org charts as being networks, but they are, right? And so a flatter organization is going to necessarily involve, right, fewer connections between anyone in the organization. I mean, fewer links, fewer steps away, right? Because you're going to get rid of some of those layers. So you'll be able to, reach higher up in the hierarchy much more quickly.
Yes, but then you've got the other effect, and we're all constrained by the fact we live in this amazing universe. But you've got Dunbar's number, which is at about 150, we start losing track of who these people are. But even before that, anybody who's grown an organization, for example, as I grew my consultancy company, as we got past 10 or 12, it changed. At 20, it changed. At 30, it changed. At 50, it changed. Yeah. It's not just the network that's going on; it's the degree to which you can take into account all the things that you see and hear, and the information loading that you've got, and be able to discriminate what is really valuable from what might be less valuable. As I say, there's a really rich research thing sitting in here.
Well, look, I mean, you have throughout your career launched all of these different enterprises and initiatives. And I mean, what is it about people like you? Right? Because obviously it's clearly frequency dependent. Everybody can't be doing the kind of stuff that you're doing. But how do you recognize that there's an opportunity there to do these kinds of things?
Greg, the honest answer is I don't know. I mean, I referred to beekeeping earlier. When I was at school, I decided I wanted to keep bees because I'd read something in an old book, and my parents wouldn't let me keep bees at home. So I started a school beekeeping club, and I financed the whole of that school beekeeping club by selling the honey. Right.
Right.
Now, okay, so I kind of tripped into being an entrepreneur. I think there is there's a if I talk about my own personal experience, because I see things as systems, and I see the potential for business models and for not for making money, but for doing something really interesting. I've got a collaboration. I co-founded a company which is based in Glasgow in the United Kingdom, which has a universal machine which will make any molecule. Right, and we've just completed another funding round, and it is going to change the world. So I'm not into that because it's going to make a lot of money, though I hope it will, with any luck. I'm really interested in this is an exciting, interesting way of doing something completely different. Now, is that innate? Partly, I suppose. Can it be taught? Well, there's a lovely example in Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, not Persuasion, in Pride and Prejudice, where Elizabeth is sitting at the piano, and she is taking the mix slightly out of Darcy. Anybody who's read this book or seen the films or stuff will know what I'm talking about. But basically, Darcy is a bit of in the book is portrayed as being rather stuck up. And he says to her, well, I'm not very sociable and I don't dance because I'm not inclined that way. That's not my nature. And Elizabeth says, well, I don't play the piano very well, but I put it down to not practicing enough. And I think there is an element of that we should be encouraging people to practice more. And
that's change mindset, right?
Sorry?
that's change mindset.
Yeah, it's a change mindset.
That's Carol Dweck.
And if I may say so, if you look at, for example, the difference between the British and the American education system, I was talking about this with an American friend recently. The American system has this show and tell, which undoubtedly when you were at school, you did show and tell. We don't have that. And I think there's a big difference, if you have learned how to stand up in front of your classmates and talk about something like that, that's a very different kind of behavior. And, you might say that's part of why the American economy and so on is quite so successful, because it teaches that right at the beginning.
Wow, it never occurred to me. I remember doing show and tell. I remember my parents went to Hawaii and came back with lava rocks. And so, of course, I had to do all sorts of research on lava and then went to the show and tell and handed around the lava racks and gave a little lecture on lava. Like, okay.
Yeah, there you go.
And when we have startups come here,
these make a big difference. And status of hypothesis, it's nothing, it's a possibility, but it's the kind of thing that one ought to look into about what are the interventions early on, whether it's my beekeeping or whether it's show and tell or whatever else it is. I've applied it with my kids. They've all had very early opportunities to do kind of entrepreneurial things, and they're all doing entrepreneurial things. Now, whether, I don't know, as I say, these are hypotheses. I'm not going to say, I've suddenly discovered this particular rule, but I suspect that, as I said, human beings, particularly one of the reasons why I did the Cambridge Science Centre, for example, is I'm a great believer in getting this stuff into kids' heads between the ages of 5 and 11. But certainly, up until maybe 14, 15, 16, exposure to this kind of stuff makes such a difference.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things when we host groups from outside of the U.S., particularly outside of California, we teach them how to pitch. And we'll find these folks from Germany, let's say, who have these incredible businesses, these wonderful technologies, and they just simply can't pitch. And on the American side, we'll have people who can do these amazing pitches, but their product is garbage.
Well, I've got lots of American friends. I mean, I was visiting a friend in Philadelphia. He's a Philadelphia lawyer, by the way, but that's another matter. And he took me to meet one of his partners, and we had this lunch. And I tried to turn the volume up, right, to be, and I got the comment back in the evening that the partner thought that was a very interesting conversation, but I was a little quiet. I just didn't. I failed to calibrate properly for the environment I was in.
Yeah. Well, look, I think also in terms of personality traits, I mean, there is curiosity and there is a bunch of other things, but it does seem
Yep.
also that there involves an element of faith, right? So we here in Silicon Valley, we talk about pay it forward. And in a way, it's kind of almost religious because you do these things and you're not looking at it through a ROI lens. You're not looking at it through a NPV lens. You're not thinking, if I introduce this person to this person, this is how much money I'm going to get out of it. Or if I go to this meeting, this is the value per minute that I'm going to spend at this meeting. And so there's this inherent faith that somehow, in some capacity, this exploration is going to provide me with some benefits, and it might be in some cosmic, chaotic way. Do you think that that's an element here?
Yes, I think it's very important. There's a book which is sitting on my bookshelf and I can't see it now, which is about altruism and why altruism, which seems to be, if you're a strict game theorist on individual single round games, like the Prisoner's Dilemma, just doesn't look as if it's going to work. But it actually does work in human society, and the reasons for it are very interesting about the way in which we set these networks and play multi-round games. And going back to my point about evolutionary stable strategies and why does this work? Or if you're going to dress it up into fancy language, your philosophy of life about how do you approach these things. Well, your philosophy of life is actually a repertoire of things you're going to do, which you have learned then gives the greatest long-term benefit. Now, some of that, if you're too short-term, both of us probably have learned this. If you're too short-term about stuff, you're never going to get stuff back. You have to be generous. You have to give into networks. You have to offer stuff to people. But it turns out that in my experience, that turns out to be quite a good strategy. I may not get an immediate payback off that one thing that I've done, but ultimately, when I look at the totality of all of that, I've got far more back from the efforts that I've made doing that than the efforts that I put in. And it's not quite like that because you can't do that quite do that balancing. But it is an openness to these things that really makes a difference. And the analytical narrowing down to an immediate payoff is, in my view, absolutely wrong. Absolutely wrong.
Well, with all this talk of evolutionary stable strategies, I'm glad you are channeling your fellow Cantabrigian, John Maynard Smith, who I often talk about a lot in my classes, who probably should have won the Nobel along with John Nash, right? So lots of fertile ideas coming out of Cambridge.
Yeah, a lot of these ideas, and some of them are right, some of them are wrong. But the ideas are really interesting, and some may turn into stuff that turns out to be really valuable for everybody.
Well, look, I love the book. It's Serendipity. It doesn't happen by accident. You could have a subtitle say, how to engineer serendipity in your life, your organization, and your community. Thanks so much, David.
Thanks, Greg.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.